Hello, students. I'm coming to you with the next video lecture on Chapter 8, which covers conceptualization in quantitative and qualitative inquiry. In this video lecture, we will discuss the following topics: conceptualization in quantitative studies, roles and types of variables, positive and negative relationships between variables, research questions versus research hypotheses, operational definitions, indicators and dimensions, and we will also pause to just think about the problem formulation process and how we put all of the things that we learned about problem formulation together. And finally, I will end by providing a brief note on conceptualization in qualitative studies. So in terms of learning objectives, at the end of this module, you are expected to be able to do the following: describe the meaning and timing of conceptualization in quantitative research studies. Describe the role of variables in quantitative research studies. In particular, how a variable could be an independent variable in one study, a dependent variable in another study, and a control, mediating, or moderating variable in another study. Distinguish between the different types of variables that can be employed in quantitative research studies. Describe the difference between positive and negative relationships between variables in quantitative research studies. Describe and distinguish the difference between research questions and research hypotheses in quantitative research studies. Describe the process of operationalization in quantitative research studies. Distinguish between and describe the difference between indicators and dimensions of a concept. And finally, describe the timing of conceptualization in qualitative research studies. So we are still in Unit 3, which covers problem formulation and measurement. In the last video lecture, we discussed Chapter 7, which covers problem formulation. And again, in this video, we will discuss Chapter 8, which covers conceptualization in quantitative and qualitative inquiry. We will conclude this unit by discussing Chapter 9, which covers measurement. So in the last video lecture, we discussed the following aspects of problem formulation: identifying a research topic or problem and posing an initial research question. We also discussed sources of research topics and problems in social work practice. In addition, we discussed components of good versus bad research questions. We also discussed sharpening research questions and the role of literature reviews in helping us to sharpen our research questions. We also discussed 5 purposes for conducting research. And finally, we discussed the importance of considering the time dimension as well as the unit of analysis. So all of these topics are related to the first 2 steps in the problem formulation phase, as you can see in the diagram on the right. So in this video lecture, we will focus primarily on this 3rd step in the problem formulation phase, which involves conceptualizing each of the variables in our study, as well as formulating hypotheses, deciding on the variables that will be included in our study, and also operationalizing each of the variables that will be included in our study. So now let's begin by discussing conceptualization in quantitative studies. So before we talk about the process of conceptualization, it's first important to define what a concept is. So a concept is a mental image that symbolizes an object, an idea, an event, a behavior, a person, etc. Concepts are also called variables, so you will hear me use these terms interchangeably throughout this lecture. So in terms of conceptualization in quantitative studies, the process of conceptualization involves the researcher moving from vague ideas about what they want to study to being able to observe these ideas in the real world. Conceptualization involves specifying what is meant by abstract concepts. Here, the researcher provides a nominal definition of all study concepts that includes a set of words to help understand what a term means. So in other words, for every concept or variable that is included in our study, we must provide a definition for each concept in order to be able to observe these concepts or variables in the real world. And oftentimes what we see happen in research studies is that the way in which one researcher might define a particular concept or variable could be different than the way that the next researcher chooses to define that same concept or variable. So for example, the way in which social support is defined in one study might be different than another study. The way in which depression is defined in one study might be different than another study. So the most important thing is that we as researchers have to decide within our study and for the purposes of our study, and depending on the goal or aim of our study, it's important that we define for ourselves and for our reader what we mean by every single concept or variable in our study. And this does not mean that this does not mean that this can't be different in another study. So it's just important that when we talk about conceptualization, that it's really about how we define and conceptualize variables in our study, not across studies, but in our study. So in terms of the timing of conceptualization and quantitative studies, the timing and nature of conceptualization in quantitative studies occurs toward the beginning of the social work research process, specifically during the problem formulation phase. So right here, okay, so this is where we typically begin to think about how we're going to go about defining every single variable in our study as we are formulating our problem. This is where we start to become even more granular, even more specific. So we're really throughout the whole research process going from general to specific, where we kind of start with a broad topic, and then we decide on specific research questions. And then from there, we decide on what variables or concepts we're going to examine in our study. And then once we decide that, then we have to then decide, okay, how are we going to define each of these variables or concepts? And then how are we going to measure each of these variables or concepts? So as we move through the process, we're becoming more and more specific about what exactly we're doing and how we're doing it. Okay, so that's a part of the process. So here's an example of some concepts that we'll use throughout the rest of this lecture. So of course, there are tons of concepts that we can study, but these are just some examples that we can draw upon throughout the rest of this lecture. So we're just going to take one of these concepts as an example, and we are going to conceptually define it. Okay, so the concept that we're going to focus on here is parenting self-efficacy. So as you can see underlined in the red, the way in which we will define parenting self-efficacy is as the degree to which the parent feels competent and confident in handling child problems. So that is the way in which we will define parenting self-efficacy. And this is just an example. But again, if we go back to the previous slide, we see that there were about 6 different concepts or variables on that slide. If we were actually really doing a study, we would have to define all of them, not just parenting self-efficacy, but just for the sake of time, I'm only defining this one variable just so that you can get a sense of what we mean when we say conceptually define a variable. Notice that the definition here comes from a research study. So I didn't just pull this definition out of thin air, right? So I found in the research literature that I was reviewing at the time in preparation for conducting this study, I looked at studies of parenting self-efficacy. I also looked at measurement tools that measured parenting self-efficacy, and I found a definition in the literature that fit my purposes. Okay, and so we're not just making up definitions here. We want to find definitions within the research literature that help us to define the variables in our study. So now let's talk about the role and types of variables in research studies. So we have several different types of variables. We have extraneous variables, we have moderating variables, we have constants, and we have mediating variables. So these are just some examples of types of variables. And so as we move throughout the rest of the next few slides, I'm going to provide you with some examples of each type of variable, just so that you can see. You have the definitions here that you can read in your own time, but I want to give you more concrete examples so that you can kind of see how these things can actually play out in a research study. So let's say we want to examine the relationship between the concepts of depression and parenting self-efficacy. And so just on a very basic level, we know here that our independent variable is depression and our dependent variable is parenting self-efficacy. But at the same time, we know that in the real world and in social work, many of the problems that we face are much more complex, right? So it's not always as simple to say that depression influences parenting self-efficacy. There are so many other variables that can be at play here. So if we think back to the slide that I just showed you with all the different variables on it, so many of those variables can also be at play in this relationship between depression and parenting self-efficacy. And so oftentimes what we try to do in the research process is we try to model the real world. We try to model the reality of the human beings that we are seeking to better understand through our research. And so we really have to add some complexity to this, right? This is just way too simple to be talking about actual human beings here. And so putting variables into different roles within our research study helps us to kind of mirror the complexity of life. So for example, again, we want to look at or examine this relationship between depression and parenting self-efficacy, but we also maybe want to consider certain variables as moderators in this relationship. And so moderators change the strength and or direction of the relationship between two variables. So perhaps social support may diminish the effect of depression on parenting self-efficacy or change the direction of the relationship such that parenting self-efficacy influences depression rather than depression influencing parenting self-efficacy. So when we add social support into the mix, perhaps the strength of the relationship between depression and parenting self-efficacy could change. So it can either strengthen this relationship or it can weaken the relationship, or it can change the direction of the relationship. So perhaps we thought that maybe depression influenced parenting self-efficacy, but maybe when we add social support into the equation, maybe it changes the direction of the relationship in such a way that parenting self-efficacy influences depression. So when we add in this moderator, it kind of adds some, as I mentioned before, some complexity to this relationship. And it allows us to look at this relationship in a different way, because as I mentioned, things are not that simple, right? And so we want to try to model reality and human beings and their lives and the various phenomena that we're studying. We want to try to model that with as much complexity as possible, because we know that human behavior in life is complex. So we sometimes in the literature see where researchers may include moderating variables. Okay, so this is just an example of a moderator. Researchers may also consider what we call mediators. Okay, so mediators are exactly what it sounds like, a medium that intervenes between two variables or reveals some kind of causal link or causal chain. So perhaps social support has an indirect effect on parenting self-efficacy through depressive symptoms. So in other words, perhaps it could be that depression influences social support, and then in turn, social support influences parenting self-efficacy. So rather than just looking at this direct relationship between depression and parenting self-efficacy, including social support into the mix as a mediator helps us to understand sort of the underlying mechanisms or the causal link that explains this relationship between depression and parenting self-efficacy. In addition, we also have extraneous variables. So extraneous variables are variables that interfere with our ability to observe the true relationship between an independent variable and dependent variable of interest. So perhaps work-related stressors, though they may be unmeasured, still influence parenting self-efficacy and need to be controlled for. Okay, so a lot of times we find that, again, in life, because life and human beings and human nature is very complex, sometimes even though we think we're observing this direct relationship between depression and parenting self-efficacy, there could be other variables that we call extraneous variables that are at play. And so we need to take those things into account, right? And we can't account for everything. It's not possible to account for every single extraneous variable there is, but we do want to try to account for as many of them as possible so that we can be sure that we are actually observing the relationship that we think we are observing, and that there's not some other, what we call third variable out there in the universe that perhaps we know nothing about that we're not taking into consideration. And so we call these third variables, we call them extraneous variables. And so this is another type of variable that oftentimes researchers take into consideration in their studies. And then finally, constants. Okay, so essentially what happens is once we learn as researchers what variables could potentially be extraneous in our study, we control them or we hold them constant. So any variable that we learn might be extraneous, those variables typically become the constants in our studies. And so how do we know which variables to control for or which variables should be constants? Typically, we look to the research literature for that. So other researchers help us to know, okay, I conducted this study, and in this study, I control for these variables. And so you might want to consider doing the same. So in other words, we look to what other researchers have done in their studies, and that gives us some cues on what variables we should be taking into consideration. So again, extraneous variables are the pesky variables that interfere in our ability to understand the relationship that we're actually trying to observe. And so whatever extraneous variables we're able to discover or learn about through other researchers, those are the variables that we hold constant. Those become the constants, okay? So in this case, we see this variable again, work-related stressors, right? So if we know that work-related stressors is an extraneous variable, then now we're gonna hold that constant, okay? So that becomes a variable that we hold steady in order to observe this true relationship that's happening between depression and parenting self-efficacy. And so the last thing I want to say here is that I want you to know is that there's nothing inherent in any variable that makes it an independent variable, a dependent variable, an extraneous variable, mediating, moderating, or constant. There's nothing inherent in a variable that makes it take on any of these roles, okay? So the role that each variable plays depends on how it's being conceptualized in any given study. So the way in which one researcher may conceptualize it or the role that one researcher may assign to a particular variable may be different than another researcher. And a lot of times the way we even know to assign certain roles to certain variables in our study is by looking again at the literature. What have others done, right? Is it the case that some researchers have always put certain variables in certain roles, and so now we want to make a contribution as a researcher by perhaps switching up the role some of these variables and making perhaps what some researchers only consider to be independent variables in their study, perhaps we want to switch it to the dependent variable instead. Or perhaps certain researchers have only looked at certain variables as moderators, but now we want to look at those same variables as mediators instead. So it's really kind of looking at the literature, looking to see what others have done and what contribution you can make and based on and where the gaps are, and based on where those gaps are and what contribution you want to make, then you know what role to assign certain variables. Another way in which you determine the role of certain variables is through theory. Right? So it could be that a particular theory is leading you to assign certain variables in certain roles. So it really depends. You know, it could be certain practice models, certain theories that you're applying. It could be previous literature. It can be all these things, right? So there are several things that come into play as it relates to how we think about the role that we assign to each of the variables in our study. Now let's discuss positive and negative relationships between variables. So variables co-vary together, right? So independent and dependent variables. So in a positive relationship, two variables go in the same direction. And in a negative relationship, two variables go in opposite directions. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this. And so here's just a visual to help you understand this concept of the difference between positive and negative relationships. And so here's an example. So for example, if we were looking at the relationship between social support and depression, and we were examining a negative relationship, it would be that as social support increases, depression decreases. This is an example of a negative relationship. As one variable goes up, the other variable goes down. But the idea is that the two variables co-vary together. In other words, they move together simultaneously. Whether one's going up and the other's going down, or one's going up and the other's going up, they're moving at the same time. So for every increase, or so in other words, another way to look at this is that for every increase in the independent variable, there's a decrease in the dependent variable. That's another way to look at this. Okay, and then also positive. So this is an example of a positive relationship. So if we were looking at the relationship between work-related stresses and anxiety, then this will be stated, the way in which this would be stated is that as work-related stressors increase, anxiety also increases. So in other words, these two variables are moving together in the same direction simultaneously, but they're both going up, right? So as one goes up, the other goes up. So as the independent variable increases, the dependent variable also decreases, but it can also be the other way around, right? So as work-related stressors decrease, anxiety also decreases. Okay, so as the independent variable decreases, the dependent variable decreases. So the idea is that either they're both going up at the same time or down at the same time, okay, but both in the same direction. So now let's look at research questions versus research hypotheses. Now that we have established types of variables, we know the different types of variables that we can employ in research studies. We know something about the direction of these relationships and what they could potentially be. We know the difference between positive and negative relationships between variables. So now we can look at the difference between research questions and research hypotheses. So research questions are posed about the relationship between an independent and dependent variable. So for example, what effect does depression have on parenting self-efficacy among non-resident fathers? In this question, depression is the independent variable and parenting self-efficacy is the dependent variable. Okay, so this is an example of a research question. Now on the right, we want to look at a research hypothesis using these same variables. So research hypotheses are tentative statements that predict the relationship between an independent and dependent variable. So here's one example of so in this first example, we're just looking at the independent and dependent variable only. No moderators or mediators or anything like that, just independent and dependent variable. So the first example would be, there will be a negative relationship between depression and parenting self-efficacy among non-resident fathers. So in other words, if we're saying it's a negative relationship, we're saying that as depression increases, parenting self-efficacy will decrease, or as depression decreases, parenting self-efficacy will increase. So that's essentially the same thing, right? So this is an example of a negative relationship. Now, if we wanted to throw a moderator in there, we could pose our hypothesis in this way. Social support will moderate the relationship between depression and parenting self-efficacy among non-resident fathers. So the second example is showing you what a hypothesis could look like if we were to throw a moderator in there along with our independent and dependent variable. Now let's talk about operationalizing quantitative variables. So let's first talk about what operationalization is. So we've talked about what it means to conceptualize or define a variable. So once we have conceptualized and defined all of the variables in our study, then it's time to begin thinking about how we're going to operationalize those variables as well. So operationalization involves developing specific measurements that will result in empirical observations of things that represent concepts in the real world. It sets the stage for how concepts will be observed and how data will be collected in the real world. Okay, so essentially, this term operationalization is just a big fancy word for measurement. Okay, so it really just means, how are you going to measure for every variable in your study that you have conceptualized and defined? How are you now going to capture that variable in a measurement tool? Okay, so that's really all that operationalization means. So here's an example. We're going to look at an example here momentarily of how we operationalize parenting self-efficacy. So remember, we just looked at how we defined it. And remember, I gave you a specific definition of parenting self-efficacy that I drew from the literature, and that I had found a specific definition for how I would conceptualize this term or this concept, parenting self-efficacy. So now that we've done that, now we can talk about how we're going to operationalize parenting self-efficacy. So we're going to use a scale called the parenting sense of competence scale. Okay, so this is the scale that we're going to use to define this concept of parenting self-efficacy. And specifically within this measurement tool, this parenting self-efficacy, parenting sense of competence scale, within this tool, there is a subscale that is referred to as the efficacy subscale. So specifically, this is the measurement that we will use. So here's the measurement study. And remember, we talked about measurement construction studies in our last video lecture. So measurement construction studies are studies that allow us to learn about measurement tools, okay? And so as you can see here, the title says a measure of parenting satisfaction and efficacy. And in the first sentence in the abstract, you see we obtain normative information for the parenting sense of competence scale from 297 mothers and 215 fathers of 4 to 9-year-old boys and girls, okay? So this study tells us something about the parenting sense of competence scale, okay? And these two authors conducted this study to basically develop and test this scale. So here are the items that are included in this scale. And as I mentioned, we're not going to use the entire scale. Okay, so the entire scale is not needed. The only part of the scale that gets at this notion of parenting self-efficacy is the efficacy subscale. So as you can see, we have items on the scale that are related to parenting satisfaction. And we also have items on the scale that are related to efficacy. For our purposes, we only need the part of the scale that's related to efficacy. So that's what we're going to focus on. And as you can see on the left, in the red bracket there, you can see that these are the specific items that we will touch on from this point forward. So now that we know what the concepts are, not the concepts, rather, I'm sorry, the items are that we are focusing on within this particular measurement tool, now let's talk about indicators and dimensions of concepts, okay? So abstract concepts are measured by specific indicators. Also, concepts may not be unidimensional. They may have multiple dimensions that require multiple sets of indicators. So in other words, some of the concepts that we study or variables that we study and research are just unidimensional. They don't have these separate dimensions of parenting satisfaction and parenting efficacy. Sometimes the measurement tools that we use are just unidimensional. It's one set of items. There's not these sort of subscales within this larger scale, right? But in this case, we're dealing with a measurement tool or a concept rather that is multidimensional, okay? And so what I mean by this is that we have this parenting sense of competence scale, but parenting sense of competence is considered a multidimensional concept in this case. And there are two dimensions: satisfaction and efficacy, okay? And so we see here at the top that our indicators of satisfaction are the items that we see here, okay? So these are all of our items that are indicators of satisfaction. In other words, indicators are, these are the items that we actually use to measure parenting satisfaction. So these are indicators. And if we read through each of these items, we'll see that all of them have something to do with satisfaction. They're all indicating parenting satisfaction in some way. And so this is how we actually measure things in the world. We measure things in the real world, rather. We measure things in the real world through these indicators, right? So we would include these indicators in our survey that we administer to our population of interest. And so this is the way that we're able to get at these concepts or variables and actually measure them in the real world, is through these indicators, okay? And so as you can see again here, we have in the top portion of our scale, we have the indicators of parenting satisfaction. And then in the bottom portion here, we have our indicators of parenting self-efficacy. So again, we're really only focusing here on parenting self-efficacy primarily, but I want you to see what we mean when we say multidimensional, okay? So we're talking about this broader measurement tool that captures parenting sense of competence as a whole, right? So we're talking about parenting sense of competence as a whole, but this notion or idea of parenting sense of competence is made up of two different dimensions: parenting satisfaction and efficacy. Okay, so this is what we mean when we say multidimensional. Okay, so in this case, we're dealing with a measurement tool, and we're also dealing with a concept or idea that is multidimensional in nature. But for our purposes, we're only focusing on the second dimension, which is efficacy. So with all of that being said, we talked about the different types of variables, the role of those variables in research studies. We talked about research hypotheses and research questions. We talked about the difference between positive and negative relationships. We looked at this notion of operationalization and what it means to measure a particular concept or variable. We also looked at a measurement tool, and we looked at how sometimes concepts can be multidimensional in nature, and how we measure our concepts or our variables through indicators, and how indicators is what allows us to get at or measure concepts or variables in the real world. So we talked about all of these things. And in the last video lecture, we talked about even more things. And so I felt the need here to just kind of pause and just talk about the problem formulation process as a whole, and how we put all of this together, because we've talked about so many different things, and there are truly many things to take into consideration in the problem formulation phase of the social work research process. And so I kind of just wanted to lay out all the things here for you to see. And so again, we talked about identifying the research problem and posing the initial research question, and we know that this process is influenced by the literature review. Also, it's influenced by our own practice and personal experience in terms of how we even get to this point of identifying a problem, right? So oftentimes, the problems that we identify, the source of those problems, which was what we already discussed in the last video lecture, oftentimes the source of the problems that we even identify to begin with are very much so rooted in our own practice and personal experiences. And it's also rooted in our review of the literature. And then we talked about sharpening the research question and also the hypotheses. So we're now adding in hypotheses to this as well. So we talked about sharpening the research question, but sometimes in some studies, some researchers include research questions, some include hypotheses, and yet still some include both research questions and hypotheses. So it's important to understand both. But in the problem formulation phase, we are sharpening the research question, but we're also formulating and sharpening hypotheses as well. And so we know that this whole sharpening process is influenced by the literature review. It's influenced by any ideologies, paradigms, or theories we might apply. And so essentially, we are hypothesizing about the role that variables will play in our research study. We're hypothesizing about the direction of the relationship between variables. So there are a few things that we are hypothesizing about, but at any rate, in the problem formulation phase, we are sharpening our research question and our hypotheses. We are also specifying the purpose of our research. So we talked about that. And whether our research is exploratory, explanatory, whether it's for the purposes of measurement construction, for the purposes of evaluation. So we talked about all of that. And we also talked about the importance of specifying the time dimension, whether we're conducting a study that is cross-sectional or longitudinal in nature. We talked about specifying units of analysis in terms of whether we are analyzing our data or whether we are conducting our study on the basis of individuals, groups, et cetera. And we talked about ecological fallacy, right? And how it's important to be consistent about unit of analysis throughout our study. So however we pose our research questions and whatever we claim to be our unit of analysis from the beginning of our study needs to be carried out throughout the study. We need to be sure that we're consistent in our unit of analysis throughout the entire research process. And so now, as we get toward the end of the problem formulation phase, we also now understand the importance of conceptually defining all of the variables of interest in our study, which involves deciding how each concept will be defined for the purposes of our study, understanding that it could look different in another study, okay? And then now we also know that operationally defining all variables of interest is also important in the problem formulation phase. This involves deciding on how each concept will be measured or operationalized. So as you can see, as we move through the problem formulation process, with each part of the process, we become more and more and more specific. So we're really going from very general, like, I think I want to study this topic, to these are my specific questions. These are my specific hypotheses. This is the purpose of my research. This is the time dimension of my study. This is my unit of analysis. This is how I will conceptually define every variable in my study. This is how I will measure it, right? So as we get toward the end of the problem formulation phase, we're becoming more and more granular, more and more specific. And that is essentially the way things go, particularly in quantitative research. And this is the reason why pretty much throughout this whole video lecture, we've really been talking about this notion of conceptualization and operationalization within quantitative studies. And I want to make that very clear. And I'll touch a little bit on the conceptualization process in qualitative studies momentarily, but it's such a different process that I didn't want to muddy the waters by talking about both of them at the same time. Pretty much what we've been talking about throughout this whole lecture is conceptualization and operationalization in quantitative research studies. That is what we've been talking about. Okay, and so everything we've said thus far applies to quantitative research. Okay, and so the process in terms of quantitative research is that as we move through the problem formulation phase, we become more and more specific, more and more granular. We have to be specific. If we can't conceptually define our variables and we can't operationally define or measure them, we can't study them, right? So we have to nail it down and figure out exactly what it is that we want to know and how we're going to go about observing it in the real world. And we've touched a little bit on operational definitions and operationalization in this video, but we'll talk even more about measurement in the next video. And so as I mentioned previously, I just want to end by giving a brief note on conceptualization and qualitative studies. And I'm not going to go into this in too great of detail, simply because I just choose not to, as I mentioned before, muddy the waters by going into too great of detail on conceptualization and qualitative studies. I really choose to focus more so on how we go about conceptually defining and operationalizing variables in quantitative studies. I feel like it's much clearer to just focus here instead of trying to go back and forth between the two methods. I often find that students become very confused when that happens. So I really primarily focus more on this process in quantitative studies, but I do want to touch a little bit on conceptualization in qualitative studies, specifically the timing in which conceptualization occurs. So in purely qualitative studies, concepts tend to not be specified in advance of the observation and data collection process, okay? So this is very different than in quantitative studies in that we know that we conceptualize our concepts or variables in quantitative studies at the beginning, right? There's a lot of sort of detail that's specified at the beginning in quantitative studies. However, in purely qualitative studies, the conceptualization process emerges from the data in terms of how we define certain concepts or ideas based on what we learn from our participants. So let's just say we're conducting interviews, okay? So the type of data that is yielded from interviews is text data, right? So we typically interview our participants, and this is just one example, but we typically interview our participants and then we usually have those interviews transcribed. Well, when those interviews are transcribed, what we're left with is a document that is simply text. Okay, so oftentimes we get our results back in a Word document that has all the text from all the dialogue that took place between the researcher and the participant. And so what we're looking for in that text, we're looking for patterns, we're looking for concepts to emerge from that data as we read through those transcripts, as we get more acquainted with our data, as we hear our participants' voices. When we read back through that data, we allow their voices to kind of jump off the page at us, right? And we allow our understanding of the concepts or ideas or patterns that are being shown in the data, we allow that to emerge. So we don't go into the process just defining variables as we think they should be defined, right? We allow our participants and their voices and what we learn from the data to define the concepts for us. And so the conceptualization process typically happens much later in the process in qualitative research studies. Instead, so as I mentioned, qualitative studies emphasize methodological freedom and flexibility so that the most salient concepts and their deeper meanings can emerge as researchers immerse themselves throughout the research process. So as I mentioned, methodologically, qualitative research is a lot more flexible than quantitative research. So we don't need to define things before we even have data, right? In qualitative research, we don't define things before we actually have the data, right? So we go out, we make our observations, we're flexible in this process, and we allow the concepts that are most salient and that have the deepest meaning to emerge from the data itself. As we immerse ourselves in the data, we're able to pick up on what concepts are emerging as most salient. What are the deeper meanings in that data? That's what we're looking for. And that's how the conceptualization process plays out in qualitative studies. And so here's another sort of visual map that just kind of helps to understand the timing of conceptualization. So again, the timing and nature of conceptualization in qualitative studies occurs toward the end of the social work research process, specifically during analysis of data and reporting. Okay, so again, we go out, we collect our data, we implement our design, we collect our data, we get our data back. Okay, we read through it, we process it, we immerse ourselves in it, we analyze it, and then we come up with our concepts that are emerging from that data. So that's essentially how the conceptualization process works in qualitative studies. And again, I'm not going too much into it, not too in depth here, but I do want you to kind of on more of a surface level, kind of understand how the conceptualization process plays out in qualitative studies and how it differs from quantitative studies. So in summary, we have talked about conceptualization in quantitative studies. We've also discussed the roles and types of variables. We've also discussed positive and negative relationships between variables. We've discussed the difference between research questions and research hypotheses. We've discussed operational definitions. We've also discussed the difference between indicators and dimensions. And finally, we've discussed conceptualization in qualitative studies. So now is the point at which I invite you to check for your understanding of these concepts. You can do this in one of three ways. You can either click on the form on the left and complete the form directly in this PowerPoint. You can copy and paste the link on the right into your browser, or you can scan the QR code with your cell phone. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next class.